I get the opportunity to introduce our second speaker. She's a friend and colleague of mine, Mandy Riso with Columbia Sportswear. She is a Portlander who's joining us today, and she'll be speaking on how to build once, deploy many using Azure DevOps and multi-stage pipelines.
Thank you.
You are on.
Alrighty. Let me get my screen going here. Right. Zoom. Alrighty. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Awesome. I'm going to move my camera in one sec. My computer changed screens on me. Just want to make this work. All right. Can everyone see me okay? I'm good. No, I'm going to put it up just a little bit. We're good. Okay. Hi, I am Mandy Riso. I'm a senior DevOps engineer at Columbia Sportswear. I've been there for about 2 years now, and my entire job is working with Azure DevOps and automating deployments into the cloud, so into Azure specifically. So today I kind of wanted to talk about or I did want to talk about, build once, deploy many with Azure DevOps and multi-stage pipelines. So a few caveats before I start. I'm not going to show Columbia Sportswear examples. Columbia Sportswear, we do a lot of extra complicated things, and I really wanted to show you that you can do this in a simple way. And the Columbia examples are just, they're too much for 30 minutes. So I really didn't want to do that. The examples have, some of the examples have been modified a little bit so they present better. So I will try to call those out when I have made some modifications. And then this is not going to be a step-by-step guide. I really wanted to point you in the right direction because working with Azure DevOps pipelines can be pretty complicated. So I really am just going to show you some bits to really point you in what direction to go to. And then I'm going to follow this up hopefully in the near future with a blog post or a series of blog posts to really give you the step-by-step. There's really just too much to cover in 30 minutes to dig that deep. So I wanted to follow up with a little bit more. So what is build once, deploy many? So this is a generic term for having one artifact or one set of your code being deployed into multiple places. So like it could be multiple servers, which is not usually, but it's usually mostly for multiple different environments. And the big thing with that is that your code is the exact same. You're not rebuilding it for every single environment. And that way, if there's any differences in the environments themselves, you can typically rule out that it's your code that's the problem. But also, if you have QA users or production users and they are interacting with your application differently, you can get a different perspective from that. So that's kind of a big reason why you want to go this route. A more traditional way of doing this is with multiple different applications. You have typically Jenkins is an application that you'd use to build your artifact, and then you'd put that artifact into JFrog Artifactory, and then you download the artifact into the a build server, and then you would deploy it with like GitLab or Octopus deploy. With Azure DevOps, everything is handled within one pipeline, which I think is really great. Everything is in one YAML file, and so that way your build is in the one pipeline, your publish is in the one pipeline. Azure DevOps also has a built-in pipeline artifacts and artifacts repository that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then they have their own pipeline agents that you don't need to worry about. And then you can also deploy with the same pipeline. So how to do all of this with Azure DevOps. My biggest suggestion that it's come out in the last about 1.5 to 2 years has been templates and multi-stage pipelines. So the templates and multi-stage pipelines are meant to replace the release pipelines with Azure DevOps. And there's not a lot of really great documentation on how to do this deploy once, build once, deploy many. So we're going to do a quick little overview of this. Like my previous caveat, I don't have the entire pipeline definition listed. There is a little bit of work up above that I have excluded because I really wanted to focus on this template and multi-stage pipeline. So what I really want you to pay attention to is line 5. That is within the build stage, and we're calling a build template. It's just a one-liner, which is really nice. And then we have some parameters, and we'll go over the parameters a little bit later. And then lines 13 and 21 really want you to pay attention to because it's the same exact template being called for different environments. The structure of 9 through 15 and 17 through 23 is the exact same. You don't have to do anything extra or different, and this is all within one YAML file, which is super helpful. And when you're doing hundreds upon hundreds of these, like our team does, this is gold. So what do you need in your build or publish template? So I'm calling this a build or publish template because not all code needs to be built. Like Python, you don't need to compile it. You can absolutely build it into a binary to run on a server. You can totally do that, but you don't have to. I'm going to be showing a .NET example where you do need to be doing a build. Some of the things that I suggest that are not required is having a code scanning step, building your code if needed, unit testing, because testing is important. And then the most important part is publishing your artifact. So scanning your code. There's a ton of extensions that you can install for Azure DevOps that do scanning for you. For instance, Microsoft has a credential scanner that you can just install and then call as a task. I think that it's really great to have a bunch of built-in things like that where you don't have to write anything yourself. There's also security scanning that can be happening, code quality scanning, linting. All I think is really important. On this example, I didn't list out all of those scans because I wanted to show you that you can call a template within a template. That helps for modularity. If you're going to be scanning your code in multiple different types of build templates, you can just have that one template and do that. On line 1, you'll see I have job and I'm calling it scan. You can run multiple jobs within a template, and you can run them in parallel. So, and I'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. That way you can run your scanning and your building and your testing all in parallel. It runs your pipelines a little bit faster, especially if you have a lot of code. So building or compiling your code, there's a wide variety of built-in tasks, and then you can also get some other extensions. You can also write your own scripts in order to build the code if you want, if you need. This example is a test and publish job, test, build, publish job. I'll show you a little bit more of those steps in a little bit. But the built-in task to build a .NET application from lines 6 through 9, that's literally all you need. That's a built-in task. The solutions call is literally just like that. It builds all the solutions in your file and boom, you're built. Unit testing, huge fan of unit testing. I highly recommend it. You can also, again, there's a lot of built-in tasks for this. You can also run your own custom scripts. And then another really cool thing is that Azure DevOps Pipelines has is you can view your test results and your code coverage results within the pipeline. There's a tab at the very top in the runnings. There's multiple tabs there. There's one for test results and one for code coverage. And you can publish those results. So what I'm showing in this example is the task on line 1 is running the code, is running the tests. Line 3 is enabling the code coverage, and that creates the report. And then the task on line 6, that's just publishing the test results. And this is, again, all you actually have to do. I didn't modify this one at all. It's really straightforward. And then for the code coverage task on line 13, I did change this a little bit. I stripped out the default working directory variable just to make this fit a little bit better. I will show that, I believe, on the next slide, just so you can kind of see how it looks. But for the most part, this is exactly how we would normally have it. It's pretty straightforward. One thing I do also want to call out is lines 11 and 19. Those are conditions, succeed or failed. What that means is any task before those that even if it has failed, to always run. So if your unit test failed, which can definitely happen, you still get your results of both the unit tests and the code coverage. And then the most important part of this all is publishing your artifact. Like I was saying, that I stripped out that default working directory, I could keep that variable here. If you have ever worked with Azure DevOps Pipelines before, you're very familiar with this. It's a way to grab literally what it says, the default working directory, and then you can start off from there. This publish task, this is the shortcut that I think it looks a little bit cleaner. It's a little bit more obvious of what it is. If you are looking up documentation and you're not quite sure what to find, it's the it's the publish pipeline artifact task that I'm showing here. I'm also putting in the display names in all of these. It's going to help you a lot to use the display name. It's going to be what's going to show up in your pipeline runnings. You can dynamically add your artifact name or your app name or anything else that you want in those display names. So it helps you figure out what steps are what and for what application if you need it. So the deploy template, similar to what I was just talking about, these are suggestions. The only thing that you absolutely need to have is the deploy artifact. You might think you need the download artifact, but you don't actually need it with a deployment job. You get that for free, which is great. I'm also going to talk about setting up approvals in Azure DevOps. It's not really obvious in the documentation how to set that up. So I'll kind of talk about it in a little bit. I'm not going to go over deploying the artifact or the post-deployment tests, even though I think the post-deploy tests are very important. Deploying the artifact, there are so many different variables. I definitely could have shown how to do a web app, but there's a lot of other things that you can do. I think that documentation is a lot easier to find. I really wanted to focus a little bit more on the setting the approvals, because I think that documentation is really lacking. There's a lot of missing steps. So I kind of wanted to go over that. So downloading the artifact, like I said, you do get that for free with a deployment job. The reason I keep talking about a deployment job is because that's where you get your approvals, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. This downloads to a different directory. that variable is a pipeline.workspace variable. If you have ever worked with jobs specifically, you're pretty much only working with the default working directory. This pipeline workspace directory is in fact different, so you want to make sure you pay attention to that. If you do want to download the artifact and filter it, or download it from another pipeline running, you can do that. You'll want to use this download pipeline artifacts task. Similar to the publish one, I'm using the shortcut. This is in fact how you use it for the shortcut, but you can also spell it all out with the version number and everything, and it works just the same. The syntax might be just a little bit different. So in this example, we're downloading the current artifact from the current pipeline. That's what that current means. It's from the current pipeline. The artifact name is web app, and then we're only filtering on the JavaScript files. So previously I showed publishing the unit test results as well as the code coverage results. This download would not download those files, which I highly recommend still doing, and we'll go over that later. So deployment jobs. These are where you're going to get your approvals for the multi-stage pipelines. So like I mentioned, the download happens for free, so I'm not going to put that in here. On line 8, that environment, that's actually how we're going to set up the approvals, and I'll show you in the next coming up slides. Line 8, I will again show you in a little bit when we're talking about the environment specifically, but that's a way to use the parameters and dynamically grab an environment based off what you need. If you are used to the jobs, the deployment job has its own keyword. So lines 3 through 12 are going to look a little different syntax wise than you're used to if you've worked with the normal jobs. But that's really the most important part. And then from 13 on that I stripped off, they look identical in the syntax and how you use them. One other thing I wanted to point out on line 11 is that run once. This is the least complicated example, and I wanted to make sure I showed you. Run once means it's not a rolling deploy. It literally runs all the steps below it one time. You don't have to keep it won't keep going. So that's just something to pay attention to if you do want a rolling deploy. The documentation isn't fantastic in those cases as well. So there's going to be a lot of digging of that. Approvals. I wanted approvals to get, like I said, its own little set of time because the documentation really is lacking in this case. It really focuses on Kubernetes and VM resources, and the documentation almost makes it seem like you have to have a resource in order to have approval, but that's just not true. So I'm going to walk you through how to add an environment, add approvals, use the environment in the templates and in the pipeline definition file, and then how to approve the stages. So adding the environment, that deployment job, if that ran with a environment name, it would actually create the environment automatically if it wasn't there. But then you wouldn't get the approval right away. So I always recommend to my stakeholders that if they want approvals, they manually create it themselves. And I actually noticed that the documentation has changed recently on that, and it's not as step-by-step as it used to be. So if you're having troubles, feel free to message me, email me, send me something on Twitter. I'm happy to help. And if you have more questions, who knows, I might make a talk on that as well. So way to do manually adding the environment. Under pipelines environments, you want to go into there. And then at the top right, there's going to be a new environment button. You're going to go ahead and click that. Something that isn't great in the documentation, like I said, is it really focuses on Kubernetes and VMs. There is an option for a no resource, none resource. You're going to want to select that if you're not doing anything with Kubernetes or VMs, because you don't need a resource. So once that has been created, you're going to be in the environments view. It's going to take you there immediately. And at the top right hand, there's going to be an add resource button and then a menu ellipsis. So you're going to want to click the menu button. And then approvals and checks is where we're going to want to go next. Once you're on the approval and checks, it's actually going to take you to like a whole new view. In the top right corner, there's going to be a plus sign. You're going to want to hit that, and then it'll say add checks, select approvals. That's going to take you to this menu here at the bottom, and you have users, groups that you can add in there. One thing I want to mention that isn't, if I remember correctly, that's also not in the documentation, is if you have multiple users listed, all of them have to approve. So I always recommend to my stakeholders to use a group if they only want one person to approve of a list. This, if I remember correctly, this is the same way of how the release approvals used to work. And then another thing that I wanted to call out is when you're creating the approvals, this allow approvers to approve their own runs is automatically checked. You'll want to uncheck that if you don't want, if you want a second person to do a check on that. One other thing I didn't mention is another big difference if you're used to working with releases is the releases, the approvals, you have to add them for every single pipeline. For this, it's going to be for every environment. So it actually is project wide. You don't have to redefine them for every single pipeline, which I think is a huge time saver, especially since you have to go into the UI to still specify approvers. So using the environment, going back to that deployments job example that we had, line 8, dynamically calling the parameter to use the environment that has been passed in. You can also hard code if you only want it to go to one place, but the huge benefit of having templates is to dynamically do things and dynamically get different values. So this is a good way to do that. So on the pipeline definition side, lines 14, 15, and 23, 22 and 23, that's how you pass in parameters to the templates. You can have a long list of parameters. You can see on lines 6 and 7, I'm also doing that with a completely different type of parameter to the build template. This is how I would specify an environment parameter and then what type I wanted in there. At first, these were only ever, it only ever took string parameters, but now it's opened up to a lot of different type of parameters. So you want to be careful of the types when you're using them. Approve stages. So when you're having, if you only ever list users, all of them will get an email notification once the pipeline needs to be approved, or once that stage needs to be approved. If you're looking at groups, unfortunately, that still doesn't work. There's been an issue open since August 2019, and I've been following it since then, and it still unfortunately hasn't been resolved. I don't know what's going on there, but so another option that I always suggest to my stakeholders is using the webhook for Slack or Teams. You get a notification into your channel or instant or message or however you want to handle that whenever the pipeline needs to be approved. And then you can always manually navigate to this stage, click that checks passed section there on that stage, and then it'll open up a window that you can approve on. So this is now what the pipeline that we created together will look like. You can see each stage is dependent on each other. You can definitely change that. I didn't want to get too much into that. That build stage, you can see it has 3 artifacts listed. You can click into that and download the artifacts if you want. That's where the app artifact is, where the code coverage is, and where the unit test results are as well. So that's why we have 3 separate artifacts. then the deploy stage went, and then that prod stage that we had to wait for approval for was approved and it finished running. So this is how you would do the build once and deploy many. We want to populate the pipeline or the artifact all the way through. Any questions?
So if you have any questions, post them in the chat and I'll pose them to Mandy. I have a question just because I was looking. So at the end of a lot of your templates, you have @self. What's that in reference to?
Oh yeah, let me go back if I can here. So I think this one's it. Yeah. So this is a new thing that I've learned. So one great advantage of Azure DevOps is you can use the templates from any repository within your organization with a little bit of setup. Unlike GitHub Actions, you can't do that yet. They have to live in your own repository. So this one, I am grabbing the template from my local repository and in the templates directory. So that @self is not required when you're calling it within your own repository, but I wanted to show that in case you ever need that, because you might have different dependencies from multiple different places. So it was kind of like a little nugget.
Okay. We got one question. How do you do caching or dependency depth/artifacts between stages?
Yeah, so there is multiple caching, built-in caching steps or tasks, I mean. For the specific ones that you want, you will have to look it up. But for the artifact that you have published itself, there isn't caching because these actually run on different servers, if that makes sense. Each stage gets its own pipeline agent. So it would have to download each time, but it's usually not very big, your artifacts.
Okay. I don't see any other questions, so I'll give everybody a awkward 7 count to post their questions in, and we'll move on. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.